Welcome to the next in our series of online lectures for History 107. Today we're going to move north and talk about another English colonial effort. And that colonial effort is going to be in New England. As always, there are some key terms that you should be able to identify by the time this lecture is over, and some questions you should be able to answer as well. So with that said, let's get to it. The story of the settlement of New England is probably the one that is most familiar to Americans. I don't know about you, but I remember studying this as early as first grade. Around Thanksgiving time, we all made paper pilgrim hats out of construction paper, and we sat down to enjoy a simulated Thanksgiving feast that consisted largely of popcorn and candy corn. Still, the lesson stuck. We learned that the Pilgrims came to America so that they could worship God freely. We also learned that the Pilgrims quickly made friends with the Indians, who taught them how to plant corn. Grateful for the assistance, the Pilgrims invited the local tribes to a Thanksgiving feast, hence the first Thanksgiving. Now, there is some truth to this story. For example, the Pilgrims were persecuted in England for their religious beliefs. However, once they established their colony in America, they also persecuted anyone who did not accept their specific view of Christianity. Quakers, and especially Catholics, were not welcome in the new colony. As for the Indians, they were indeed instrumental in helping the Pilgrims to survive. In return, the two groups did get along pretty well, at least at first. However, within a few decades of settlement, the colonists were working to exterminate tribes who settled in what they saw as the land given to them by God. Before we can better understand the colonial settlement of New England, we need to get a little background. Let's begin with the English colonists. Who were they? Well, the Pilgrims were part of a new religious movement in England known as Puritanism. But what is a Puritan? Puritans were a product of the Protestant Reformation, which began in Europe in 1519. That event split the Christian church in Europe into two large groups, Protestants and Catholics. Protestants later split into still more groups, such as Methodists and Lutherans and Baptists, etc. Puritans were Protestants, and they enthusiastically supported the cleansing or purifying of the Christian church in England of any and all signs of Catholicism. In fact, they didn't believe most church officials went far enough in attempting to purify the church. They criticized anything they saw as a sign of Catholicism, including the use of candles or music in worship. They argued that worship should consist only of reading and interpreting the Bible. Because of these efforts to purify the church, they became known as Puritans. The Puritans made such a stink about purifying the church that they quickly made enemies. Some of these enemies, fellow Protestants by the way, began to persecute Puritans. It got so bad that some Puritans argued that they could only worship God freely by separating themselves from the Church of England, in other words, the main Protestant group back home. But not all Puritans agreed with this drastic measure. Many argued that they should stay within the church and fight for continuing change and reform. No surprise, these two groups of Puritans became known as separatists and non-separatists. Ultimately, separatists decided that the farther away they got from England, the better off they would be. One of the leaders of the separatist community in England was a man named William Bradford. Years later, Bradford attempted to explain why his group of separatists decided to take such a huge risk and migrate to America. Quote, "The place they had thoughts on was some of those vast and unpeopled countries of America, which are fruitful and fit for habitation, being devoid of all civil inhabitants, where there are only savage and brutish men, which range up and down, little otherwise than the wild beasts." End quote. Now let's look at what Bradford is saying here, because these words tell us a lot about how his group viewed America. The first thing that jumps out at me is his description of America as, quote, "vast and unpeopled," end quote. This contradicts everything we know about America before Columbus. Remember, there were millions of native peoples living in North America alone at the time that Bradford is describing. Actually, Bradford was aware of that, for in his next line he distinguishes between civil and uncivil inhabitants. What does he mean by this distinction? We can see that in the next line, where he says that the inhabitants of America are, quote, "like wild beasts," end quote. Once they made their decision to come to America, the Pilgrims had to finance their journey. Like Virginia, the Puritans formed a joint stock company. In short, they collected money from initial investors, promising to pay them a share of the colony's profits. In August of 1620, 102 colonists boarded the Mayflower and set sail for America. Only one colonist died en route. In November of 1620, they made landfall near Cape Cod in present-day Massachusetts and named their colony Plymouth. Why choose this site? The Pilgrims themselves explained that the site had clearly once been the site of a large Indian village. The forest had been cleared and fields recently planted. These fields, however, seem to have been abandoned several years back. Of course, the Puritans saw it in a very different way. They believed that God had in fact cleared these lands for them, and he was preparing the land for their arrival. Despite what the Pilgrims thought, however, the land in which they settled their Plymouth colony was not empty, nor had God cleared the land for them. Instead, it was the home of the Wampanoag tribe of Indians. The Wampanoags were a sophisticated people that practiced a mixed economy. In the spring, they would move to the coast where they planted their fields of corn, beans, and squash. After that, they would also hunt game and fish the Atlantic's rich waters. In the fall, they would return to harvest their fields and then move inland for the winter. This way of life had been severely disrupted, however, by a virgin soil epidemic that had struck the region in 1617. This epidemic had been brought by European fishermen who often stopped along the Atlantic coast to trade with the native peoples for supplies. Further good fortune greeted the Plymouth residents the following spring, when an Indian appeared out of the forest and spoke to them in English. His name was Squanto, and he would be key to the survival of the new colony. Squanto's story is a fascinating one for historians. He later explained to the colonists that he had been kidnapped by English fishermen years before and brought to England. There he learned English before finally getting back on a ship bound for America. Once back in his homeland, however, he discovered that his people had been wiped out in the virgin soil epidemic. With the arrival of the Pilgrims, Squanto became their interpreter, introducing them to the area leaders. He also helped them by showing them how to plant corn. Squanto's presence ensured that the Pilgrims would enjoy good relations with many of the area tribes. Now you'll notice that I did not say all area tribes. The Pilgrims would occasionally go to war with some native peoples. That's a story for another time, however. Still, despite all of these advantages, Plymouth struggled to survive. Whereas 102 colonists had set sail for America in August of 1620, 101 survived the journey. The first winter, however, proved deadly, cutting the Pilgrim numbers in half. What was the problem? Well, I think it was timing. The Pilgrims arrived right at the beginning of winter. New England winters are notoriously brutal still today. To make matters worse, the Pilgrims had to survive on only the supplies that they had brought with them. In November of 1621, 36 new colonists arrived. However, the colony continued to struggle. By 1630, the colony had a population of about 400 residents. Plymouth, though never as much of a death trap as Virginia, never really thrived either. The same cannot be said for another Puritan colony settled just to the north. Remember, Plymouth had been settled by separating Puritans who believed they needed to completely cut ties with the Christian Church in England if they were to survive. A second Puritan colony, Massachusetts Bay, would be the home of another set of Puritans. These were non-separating Puritans, and their story is a fascinating one. To tell that story, let's go back to England. Life for Puritans in England wasn't getting any better. Persecution under King Charles I continued, and so another group of Puritans got together and formed another joint stock company. This one they called the Massachusetts Bay Company. Unlike the Pilgrims at Plymouth, however, the Puritans who settled Massachusetts Bay Colony were non-separating Puritans. In other words, their decision to move to America was not an attempt to run away and hide. Instead, they argued that by migrating to America, they would be able to build a perfect Christian society that would be the model for the world. The Puritan minister John Winthrop declared that Massachusetts would become like, quote, a city on a hill, end quote. In other words, it would become a place for all Christians to emulate. Let's break away from our talk of the Puritans for a second to examine why this concept of a city on a hill was important. It's an idea that is the foundation of American exceptionalism, the notion that the United States is special, that it is uniquely blessed by God, that it is destined for greatness. It is an idea that will be at the heart of another idea, known as Manifest Destiny, that we are going to discuss later. Manifest Destiny argued that the United States was destined to dominate the North American continent. It was this idea that drove the U.S. to go to war with Mexico in 1846. It is also the idea that drove the U.S. to drive out Indian tribes as American settlement moved westward. And it's an idea that continues to be powerful today. In the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan quoted John Winthrop in declaring that the United States was a, quote, city on a hill, end quote. It is an idea that American politicians still bring out to justify American actions around the world. But let's go back to Massachusetts Bay. Massachusetts Bay Colony was a very different type of colony than either Plymouth or especially Virginia. One big difference was the scale of colonization. Massachusetts Bay was a massive effort on a far bigger scale than either of the two previous colonies. In 1630, more than 1,000 Puritan colonists set forth for America. That was far bigger than either Virginia or Plymouth's initial efforts. Another thing that set Massachusetts apart from Virginia is that this was a colony of families right from the start. Virginia, in contrast, was settled almost exclusively by men. It was years before the colony encouraged women and children to migrate. Nor was agriculture ever the get-rich-quick scheme in Massachusetts that it was in Virginia. Virginia, remember, ultimately got rich off of tobacco. That wasn't the case in Massachusetts, where the soil is very poor and the growing season too short. Ultimately, profit in Massachusetts and in New England in general would come from something other than agriculture. These things, the family migration, a lack of an emphasis on profitable agriculture, these things ensured that Massachusetts and Plymouth would be settled in a far more peaceful and orderly fashion than Virginia's example. Still, don't get the impression that life in New England was easy. The problem with establishing a religious paradise is that not everyone always agrees on the shape that paradise should take. Think about it. While most of us probably agree about certain things about God and Jesus, it is almost inevitable that we would disagree on some points. That's fine, as long as we agree to disagree. The Puritans in both Plymouth and Massachusetts did not agree to disagree, however. They had no patience for those who disagreed with them. One of the